On the evening of the first day of June, 2016, three female hikers recorded their entry in the route log at Redfish Lake in the Cellar National Forest. About an hour after setting up camp, one of them, 26-year-old Jill Marlowe, left the campfire and, according to her friends, was to return in a few minutes. Instead, they heard a short scream and a sound like a rock falling off a cliff. Traces of a struggle, crushed grass, and Jill's personal belongings were found near the edge of the slope. Rescuers who arrived the next morning assumed that she had fallen into the water. 2 weeks after the incident, more than 30 miles from the lake, on an abandoned farm near Atlantic, a hunter found an unconscious woman tied to a beam in an old vegetable cellar. The entry in the log confirmed that it was Jill Marlowe, a tourist who was believed to have died the night she disappeared. What exactly happened between the fall and the discovery will become clear much later. On the first day of June, 2016, three friends recorded their arrival in the route log in the Cellar National Forest. According to the record, they arrived in the Redfish Lake area in the afternoon and planned to spend one night there. The investigation materials indicate that the air temperature was stable, the wind was weak, and visibility was good, conditions that rescuers would later call typical for the beginning of summer. According to Barbara Gray and Andrea Kirk, at about 7 o'clock in the evening, the group set up a small camp on a hill a few dozen yards from the edge of the cliff. The place was popular with tourists due to its easy access to water and panoramic views of the slopes. The friends recalled the smell of smoke from the fire, the sound of the surf, and the distant hum of a motorboat. Everything seemed normal until 26-year-old Jill Marlowe walked out towards the forest, announcing, according to Barbara's reconstruction, with a phrase like she had to leave for a minute. The initial interview report compiled by the county sheriff's office recorded that the friends began to worry after about 20 minutes of Jill's absence. First, they called her by name, listened to the area of the forest, and walked around the nearest bushes. When there was no answer, Barbara suggested checking the direction of the cliff, because, as she noted, it was from there that the sounds of falling stones were heard throughout the evening. The reconstruction of events is based on their testimony. About 30 yards from the camp, near the edge of the slope, they came across Jill's scattered belongings. On the ground lay her flashlight, an inverted metal water bottle, and a fleece sweater she had taken off because of the warm weather. The grass around was crushed in 2 directions, as if someone was standing there or struggling. On one of the paths descending to the water, a broken branch the thickness of a human finger was found. It was this fact, according to Barbara, that made them think about the fall. The rescuers' official notes state that the slope in this place is really dangerous. Under the layer of soil, there is loose stone, which easily breaks off under load. The materials contain a comment from one of the employees who arrived at the scene later. Nothing unusual. Several people slip here every year. So the initial version was clear. Marlowe could have come too close to the edge, lost her balance, and fallen down. Barbara and Andrea described their condition as shocked. Judging by the case, both were in a strong stress reaction. Trembling hands, difficulty speaking, and fragmentary answers to questions were recorded. Andrea, according to the officer, looked no less frightened than Barbara, kept repeating that Jill should have heard their screams. The friends tried to go down, but due to the approaching darkness and the danger of the slope, they returned to the camp and at 10 p.m. called the rescue service via a satellite messenger registered to Barbara. The rescue department's shift log records the time the message was received and a brief summary. Possible fall of a woman from a cliff, Redfish Lake area, a group of 3 people. When the first search party arrived the next morning, the site looked the same as the day before: scattered items, skid marks on the gravel, broken stems of plants leading to the edge of the ledge. The wind, according to the weather station, was weak, so no changes in the terrain were recorded. Rescuers combed the area under the cliff for several hours, but found no traces of a fall into the water or onto the rocks below. However, at this stage, the absence of the body was explained by underwater currents or snagging on the bottom, which often happens in such conditions. The internal report states, "The probability of an accident is high. The traces at the scene are consistent with the fall pattern." The same report states that no signs of the presence of outsiders were found. Barbara and Andrea were considered only as witnesses at that time. The investigation began to form a picture of that evening, based on this data, suggesting that the incident occurred in the short period between Jill's departure to the forest strip and the moment when her friends went to look for her. So far, it looked like a typical disappearance in the area, related to natural conditions, and the investigators had no reason to believe otherwise. In the second half of July 2016, when the active phase of the search in the area of Lake Redfish had lasted for more than 2 weeks, the official reports began to lose hope. According to the County Rescue Service, divers searched the coastline and several deep pockets at the foot of the cliff, but found nothing that could belong to Jill Marlowe. The daily report of the group commander stated that as of that moment, the probability of drowning has not been confirmed, but the absence of traces does not allow to exclude it completely. It was during this period that the investigation took a turn that completely changed the initial picture of events. According to the official registration of the control room, on the morning of one of the July days, they were approached by a local resident, registered as a hunter, with a permit to shoot predators in the area of abandoned farms near the village of Atlantic. According to him, he was exploring the old barns and sheds that had survived on the territory of an abandoned farm, located a few miles from the main road. According to the hunter, during the inspection, he noticed an open hatch to an old vegetable cellar, which, he said, did not look abandoned. Inside, there was a noticeable dampness, a musty smell, and a subtle, piercing noise that could have been the usual echo of artificial sounds underground. However, after about a minute, the man heard a faint wheezing sound. The minutes of his interrogation state: he descended the wooden stairs, illuminated by a lantern, and saw a woman's body fastened with ropes to the crossbeam of the old structure. Very little light fell on the body. The shaft was deep and narrow. The woman's skin was pale, her breathing barely noticeable. The hunter claimed that at first he thought she was dead, but when he stepped closer, he heard a short, weak exhale. He immediately contacted the control room via a satellite transmitter. The entry in the rescue service log contains the exact time of the call, a description of the place, and the instruction. The victim is alive. The condition is critical. Medical evacuation is required. The first to arrive at the abandoned farm were sheriff's office employees and paramedics from the nearest station. The photos taken at the scene show a wooden ceiling with rotten beams, rusty hooks, the remains of old vegetable boxes, and a thin layer of soil on the floor. The condition of the woman found is described in the doctor's report as critical with an immediate threat to life. She had a deep tear in the skin on the back of her head and signs of a fractured skull. On the arms and legs, there were traces of prolonged binding, where the ropes cut into the skin until it turned black. The paramedic who first examined her noted that she was in a coma, responded only to strong external stimuli, and had a disturbed breathing rhythm. The medical examination report states that the body temperature was below normal and the clothes were wet, soaked with soil and dust. The victim was identified a few minutes after the deputy sheriff arrived. A bracelet with initials lay on the floor next to the dirty cloth, which, according to Barbara and Andrea, Jill was wearing on the day of her disappearance. Comparing the signs with the descriptions provided earlier, law enforcement officers found that the woman found was Jill Marlowe, who was officially searched for in a mountainous area more than 30 miles away. Paramedics lifted her to the surface using a transport system because she could not move. It was decided on the spot to urgently evacuate Jill to a hospital in Boise. The helicopter took off from the nearest helipad. The medical report attached to the case file states that she did not regain consciousness during the entire flight, and her vital signs were kept at a limit that allows immediate intervention but does not guarantee stabilization. When the information about the finding reached the sheriff's office, the initial version of the fall was revised. Investigators recorded in the official note, "The location, condition of the victim, and the nature of the injuries are incompatible with the accident model." In a secret appendix to the internal report, there is a short phrase that journalists will often quote later. "This is not a fall. This is the detention and infliction of injuries by a third party." The abandoned farm was surrounded by a tape, and the entrance to the cellar was sealed. Experts collected samples of soil, clothing fibers, footprints, and prints of possible tools. All of them, according to the preliminary conclusion of forensic experts, showed signs that the cellar had been used recently, although the farm itself had not been operating for at least 5 years. On the surface of the soil, experts recorded the tread of an off-road vehicle that did not belong to any of the official service vehicles. At the time of closing the field stage of the inspection, the key thesis had already been voiced in the reports. Finding Jill alive excludes the version of accidental disappearance and confirms the presence of at least one third party responsible for her detention and injuries. This meant that the investigation was entering a new phase, and the search operation was officially declared a criminal case of kidnapping. In the first weeks of August 2016, the investigative team involved in the case of Jill Marlowe's kidnapping received a new lead. According to an internal report by the sheriff's office, a local resident reported a man who lived as a hermit on the outskirts of the forest, and according to him, too often watched the tourists passing by. The man's identity was quickly established. He turned out to be Eric Glover, registered as a hermit without a permanent job, living in a small hut about a day's walk from the marked route. The official materials state that Glover was repeatedly seen near tourist parking lots. There were no formal statements against him, but several visitors to the park, interviewed after Jill's abduction, mentioned the unusual behavior of an unknown man who watched them from a distance. These testimonies gave the investigators enough grounds to obtain permission to inspect his property. During the search, several boxes with film photos were found. The pictures showed women walking along the trails, washing dishes near rivers, or sitting by tents. All photos were taken from a distance, sometimes through the bushes. The inspection report states that some of the pictures showed the same places where Jill's group had previously been. There was no formal evidence of Glover's involvement in the kidnapping, but his strange collection looked suspicious enough for investigators to consider him a prime suspect. It was at this point, when the attention of most of the task force was focused on Glover, that an important side point arose: which at the time seemed routine. The detective responsible for the financial analysis of the witnesses submitted an appendix to the general report on the verification of the banking transactions of Andrea Kirk and Barbara Gray. It was a standard procedure: reconciliation of expenses before the trip, analysis of possible unusual payments, and recording of financial ties. The appendix indicated that about a week before the hike, Andrea made a large cash transfer to Liam Kendall. The amount recorded in the statement was $3,000. For a standard rebuttal, the detective requested clarification. In the interrogation report, Andrea explained that it was a loan to a friend for car repair, stressing that the transaction was not related to the trip. According to the detective who conducted the interview, she turned pale at the moment of this question and was looking for the wording of the answer for a long time. Further internal analysis showed that Andrea had not previously mentioned any loan and did not indicate Liam Kendall in the list of close acquaintances. This was recorded in the relevant report. The stated financial assistance is inconsistent with the evidence obtained earlier. The detectives also drew attention to the fact that Kendall himself did not have an officially registered place of work, and in the past lived on temporary construction sites, often changing addresses. This was considered unusual for a regular loan for repairs. Despite this, at that time, the investigators still did not deviate from the main line: surveillance of Glover. Andrea actively insisted that he was the threat, and according to the officer, seemed genuinely convinced that Glover was guilty. Later, her words would be viewed in a completely different way, but in August 2016, they seemed to be a logical reaction of a witness who had experienced serious stress. The documents state that there are no direct matches between the material evidence found on Glover and Jill's kidnapping. There were no photos of Jill among the pictures. All the photos were dated before that summer, and none of the footprints or traces on the farm matched the shoes Glover was wearing. However, the collection of his photos was considered sufficient grounds to continue the investigation. At the same time, the detectives began to study Andrea's operation more closely. One of the additional memoranda stated, "The amount is significant. The time of the transfer coincides with the preparation for the trip. The connection between Kirk and Kendall needs to be clarified." While Glover was being interrogated again, one of the investigators turned to the databases to establish the last place of residence of Liam Kendall. At this stage, the investigation was in a double phase. The team's attention was equally divided between Glover's strange collection and the unclear financial connection between Andrea and the unknown man who received a significant amount of cash from her. At the same time, the reports increasingly suggested that the initial focus on the hermit alone might be wrong. At the end of the official summary for that week, there was an expression that would be often quoted later. "It is necessary to check all alternative connections of the victim and witnesses, since the main focus may be shifted to an extraneous object." It was the first hint that the investigation was moving in the wrong direction. But at that time, no one could guess how far from the truth was the version about the hermit from the woods. In the first days of September 2016, the investigation team received confirmation of the location of Liam Kendall, the person to whom Andrea Kirk had made a cash transfer a week before the hike. According to the information provided by the Elmore County Sheriff's Office, Kendall lived temporarily on a farm near Atlantic, but left his job without notice at the end of August. One of the farm workers reported that Liam had been nervous for the last few days and had asked several times to be taken to Boise. This was the first indirect confirmation that he could be hiding. Detectives tracked his bank transactions and the use of prepaid cards. One of these cards was activated in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Boise. When the officers arrived, the motel administrator confirmed that a man resembling Kendall's description had rented a room under a fictitious name. The inspection report states that the room was located on the second floor, the furniture was old, and the window overlooked the courtyard. The officers approached the room in the morning, during the period of the lowest attendance. According to one of the employees, when the police knocked on the door and called out to the guest, quick steps were heard inside. A few seconds later, Liam tried to run out through the emergency exit at the end of the corridor. A surveillance camera installed in the motel recorded him running to the stairs, but he was intercepted by two officers. The arrest took place without resistance. The materials state that Kendall looked exhausted, embarrassed, and did not take any active action. After the arrest, he was taken to the investigation department. During the initial interview, Liam insisted that the money transfer from Andrea was payment for the repair of a vehicle. However, as stated in the interrogation report, he could not describe even the basic details, neither the make of the car, nor the nature of the malfunction, nor the work he allegedly performed. The internal notes of the detective who conducted the interrogation stated, "The answers are fragmentary, inaccurate, without specifics, tangible, nervous behavior." Then the investigators proceeded to establish his whereabouts on the night Jill disappeared. When asked about this, Kendall answered vaguely. He allegedly was on the farm and could have gone to bed earlier, but he did not remember the exact hours. This did not match the records of other farm workers, who noted that during that period, Liam often disappeared in the evening and returned after midnight. The official documents also state that his belongings seized at the motel included a set of work clothes, a few personal items, and a mobile phone without a SIM card. A piece of paper with several addresses was found in his trouser pocket, including an abandoned farm near Atlantic, where Jill had previously been found. During the further interrogation, according to the protocols, the pressure on him increased. The detectives pointed out inconsistencies in his words, discrepancies with the farmer's testimonies, and unjustified behavior during the detention. According to the investigator who was present in the room, Liam at that moment began to avoid eye contact, repeated the same phrases, clenched his hands, and could not explain the reasons for his escape. When he was reminded of the possibility of a long prison sentence for complicity in a felony, Kendall changed his tone. This is documented in the third interrogation report of that day. After reading out the potential circumstances of criminal liability, the suspect became noticeably emotionally labil. It was then that he stated that he was not the main person and that the money was not related to repairs. After a few minutes of silence, according to investigators, Liam began to give the first confessional evidence. Formally, they did not yet contain a clear sequence of events, but they changed the direction of the investigation. The internal official report, drawn up the same evening, states, Kendall's testimony needs to be clarified, but it indicates the possible involvement of another party. The suspect was probably not in the status of the initiator, but the executor of third-party instructions. The set of these features, escape, unreliable explanations, lack of a real alibi, and the first indirect confessions, became the basis for changing Liam's legal status. Further on, his interrogations were to be continued in the format of full recording and with the participation of a lawyer, and the investigation, according to the reports, moved into a phase where Kendall was no longer considered only as a recipient of funds, but as a potential participant in the events related to the abduction of Jill Marlowe. In the early days of October 2016, Liam Kendall agreed to another interrogation with the participation of a lawyer. He gave his previous evidence in a fragmentary manner, confused about dates and details. However, after a long wait in the cell, and after being reminded of possible liability for a serious crime, Kendall's behavior changed. The record states that he looked exhausted, his voice was trembling, and his hands were constantly tugging at the fabric of his jeans. During the interrogation, Liam for the first time clearly stated that he was not the initiator of the events near Lake Redfish. According to him, the initiative came from Andrea Kirk, with whom he maintained an irregular relationship. The materials indicate that the acquaintance between them was superficial, but sufficient for her to know about his financial difficulties and willingness to take on various side jobs. The protocol describes his words. About a week before the trip, Andrea contacted him and offered to perform a simple task. According to Kendall, she did not give specific explanations, but stressed that it was not a crime, but rather a situation that needs to be controlled. She promised a monetary reward, which, according to Liam, was too generous to refuse. According to his testimony, Andrea instructed him to drive his SUV to the lake area, stop on an inconspicuous forest road near the camp, and wait for a signal. According to Kendall, the signal was to be a text phrase that Andrea would write from her mobile phone. The interrogation materials emphasize that Andrea's phone was later seized for analysis, but at that time no messages were found, as Kirk had already managed to clear the history. Liam further claimed that he was informed of the approximate plan of action. Andrea was to take Jill Marlowe towards the forest strip under the guise of a conversation. Kendall had to approach her from behind, quickly stun her, then load her into the car and take her to an abandoned farm near the Atlantic. According to Kendall, he was convinced that the whole action was supposed to be a tough prank or revenge for old insults, which Andrea spoke of in hints. He claimed that until the last moment, he did not perceive it as a preparation for a serious crime. The protocol records his wording. "I thought she wanted to scare her friend. I didn't know it would go that far." The investigators noted that the tone of his words was uncertain and the structure of the statements was fragmentary, but the testimony contained numerous details that coincided with the circumstances of the event. According to Kendall, when he approached the edge of the woods, Andrea was already arguing with Jill. He stressed that the dispute was not loud, but tense. The interrogation records state that Liam saw Jill trying to walk away from Andrea, after which she grabbed her arm. It was at this moment that he, according to his testimony, came out of hiding, but the situation began to develop not according to plan. Kendall said Jill began to actively resist. According to him, she pushed Andrea away and tried to escape towards the camp. It was then, according to Liam, that Andrea hit her with an object Kendall described as something heavy and wide. He stressed that this was not agreed between them. The protocol states, the suspect stated that the blow was not his action. Kendall reported that after Jill fell, he panicked. The protocol literally states, "She was lying motionless. I didn't know if she was alive. Andrea said we had to act quickly." He further claimed that he and Andrea carried the body to his car, where they put her in the back seat. Then he headed towards the farm that Andrea had chosen in advance. At the farm, he said, they took Jill to the cellar and tied her with ropes to a beam. Liam insisted that he acted mechanically and in a state of shock. He repeated that he was unaware of the severity of the injury and that Andrea assured him, "She will come to her senses, and it will all be over soon." The investigators recorded in the protocol that during this part of the story, Kendall lost logical consistency several times, sometimes fell silent, and refused to continue without being reminded of the need to cooperate. In the memo, the investigator described his condition as follows. The suspect's behavior indicates guilt, but at the same time, an attempt to distance himself from the key moment of the event. Despite this, his testimony contained many details that corresponded to the traces found in the cellar and the time frame established by the experts. The official assessment of the confession, attached to the case file, emphasized that Kendall's testimony was not perceived as the final version of events, but contained enough facts to confirm the involvement of at least one other person in the abduction of Jill Marlowe. The document also noted that the statement about not knowing the intention to cause a fatal injury required additional verification, since the actions of the participants were not consistent with the joke described by him. At this stage, the investigation formally recorded that Liam Kendall's testimony opened a new line of investigation related to the active participation of another person, who had previously been officially registered as a witness. In early November 2016, the investigation team officially received sufficient grounds to change Andrea Kirk's status from a witness to a suspect. Liam Kendall's testimony, although requiring further verification, contained detailed episodes that could only be known to the direct participants. The memo prepared by the head of the task force stated, "At this stage, the available evidence indicates Kirk's active participation in the actions preceding the abduction. The request to the district court to search her home was approved without delay." The team entered Andrea's apartment during the daytime, when she was under the supervision of 2 detectives after being called to the police station again. The apartment was a small space in an apartment building on the outskirts of the city, well maintained and without signs of a hasty disappearance. According to the inspection report, there were no signs of tampering or hidden rooms in the apartment, but the investigators' attention was drawn to an old dresser in the bedroom. In its bottom drawer, under a layer of clothes, a thin notebook in a soft cover was found. It was not publicly available. The pages did not contain dates, and many records were missing. They were torn out or neatly cut. Forensic experts immediately seized the item as a potential piece of evidence. The specialist's internal report states, "Hidden placement, lack of timestamps, and uneven records may indicate their private or compromising nature." The content analysis began the same day. Investigators found that most of the records did not contain direct references to Jill Marlowe, but a number of passages mentioned she, that night, and what no one admitted. By the nature of the presentation, the experts attributed this not to a diary of events, but to private emotional notes. However, one fragment, written in a sharp, almost breakthrough handwriting, became key. It described an event that took place about 5 years before the trip to the Chalice Forest. According to the text, Andrea pointed to the case when her younger sister was walking home from a party. It also mentioned a car moving in an uneven trajectory and a driver whom the author of the notes described as cheerful and carefree. Then there was a short but sharp sentence. "They said she was not guilty. I saw it differently." To verify this information, investigators turned to the archives of the local court and police materials for the relevant year. The search revealed a case of a pedestrian being hit after a night party in the city center. The victim was a minor relative of Andrea Kirk, who was seriously injured and left with impaired mobility. The materials of that time indicated that the driver, a person who corresponded to the signs of Jill Marlowe, was checked for intoxication. However, the court referring to the lack of direct witnesses to the moment of the collision, as well as technical inconsistencies in the original protocol, found her not guilty. The case was closed, and the victim underwent rehabilitation for a long time. Andrea's reaction to this event was recorded only by bystanders, acquaintances of the family, and several friends interviewed as part of the current investigation. According to them, Andrea was going through the incident acutely, stopped trusting the judicial system, and often said that no one was held accountable. In the notebook, some of the statements were about this. She laughed in the photos when my sister was learning to walk again. Investigators could not support emotional assessments, but the content of the notes clearly indicated a long and deep resentment. The psychological examination report stated, "The records demonstrate a constant focus on the injustice of the past and a strong internal affect associated with a particular person." It was this information that was crucial for Andrea's detention. When investigators acquainted her with the facts gathered during the search, Kirk, according to them, changed her behavior dramatically. The interrogation report states, "The suspect turns pale, loses the logical connection between phrases, tries to switch the conversation to other topics." When asked about the incident that happened 5 years ago, she answered evasively, stating several times that the case has nothing to do with the present. However, the investigators recorded that it was when she mentioned it that her emotional reaction was the strongest. The arrest took place in the presence of a lawyer. The official documents emphasized that the grounds were not only Liam's testimony, but also the materials found in the apartment, which contain indirect but significant evidence of the motive. The word motive first appeared in the official report of that day. The investigation concluded that the trip, which looked like a regular walk of 3 friends, could have been planned in advance and had a hidden purpose. At this stage, the investigation did not contain any final statements, but the totality of the data indicated a long-lasting insult that could escalate into actions that go far beyond the usual conflict. At the beginning of December 2016, the investigation approached the stage when there was no lack of evidence, but the final fixation of the motive. Andrea Kirk was kept in an isolated interrogation room in the district office building, waiting for the next procedural hearing. During this period, the defense counsel filed a petition for permission to visit her by a close person, Barbara Gray, who was a witness in the case. The petition was granted, but with the condition of full video recording of the meeting. The recording of this meeting was later described as a turning point. The camera shows a room without windows, a table with 2 chairs, and dim lighting. Barbara comes in first. Her movements are cautious. Andrea sits motionless, her hands folded, her gaze directed downwards. Investigators do not interfere, only observe through one-way glass. According to the transcript, Barbara does not ask questions. Her first phrase is a brief statement. She voices what the investigators have already established. The reason for the crime is related to the ancient tragedy in the Kirk family. This wording was recorded in the protocol as a direct mention of the suspect's sister. Andrea's reaction was unexpected, even for experienced investigators. The official notes of the officer who reviewed the recording stated, "After this statement, the suspect lost control of her emotions." The video shows her shoulders shaking. She suddenly raises her head and begins to speak in fragments without structure and logical sequence. According to the investigators, Andrea refused to object for the first time. The following wording was entered in the protocol. The suspect admits participation in the preparation and implementation of the abduction. After that, she proceeds to explain the motivation. Her words are conveyed only in fragments, not literally, but in a reconstruction compiled by analysts. According to this reconstruction, she explained that for years she had watched Jill lead a carefree and fulfilling life, while her own sister never recovered from her injuries. The report of the psychologist who reviewed the recording states, the suspect's emotional background fluctuates sharply between crying, anger, and self-blame. Her behavior indicates a chronic affect that has not found a way out for a long time. It is at this point, according to the investigator's observations, that Andrea proceeds to confess a key aspect: her own influence on the course of events in the forest. The transcript records that Andrea confirmed the conflict between her and Jill on the day of the disappearance. She described it as the moment when the past became unbearable. When Jill, according to Andrea, began to resist, the suspect explained that something in her broke. In the protocol, this is conveyed as a sudden, uncontrolled impulse. Investigators stressed that these testimonies are not an emotional fabrication. They are consistent with Liam Kendall's testimony, with a review of the material evidence, and with medical conclusions about the nature of Jill's head injury. An internal analytical note states, Kirk's words confirm the mechanism of the blow described by Kendall and the time frame of the conflict. Andrea's behavior on the recording changes dramatically in the final part of the meeting. She begins to repeat that she did not intend to cause death. According to Barbara, who testified after this meeting, Andrea said she wanted Jill to know what it was like to be helpless. This was recorded as an indirect quote, as direct speech is considered an inadmissible legal form. After a few minutes of emotional expressions, Andrea stops talking and lowers her head. The official report states that the investigators ended the meeting when her condition became unstable. The psychologist, who was present in the next room, recommended not to continue the contact. Officially, this event was formalized as a spontaneous emotional confession of the suspect, which did not replace further procedural interrogations, but became a critical element of the evidence base. All materials, video, transcript, expert opinions, were included in the case as independent confirmation of motive and intent. At this stage, the investigation received the only thing that was missing from the complete picture: a sincere, albeit chaotic, presentation of the internal logic of Andrea Kirk's actions. Her confession was officially recorded as the completion of the stage, which involved the establishment of identical testimonies of all participants in the event. In early January 2017, the legal stage of the case officially entered the final phase. After analyzing the material evidence, Liam Kendall's testimony, the video recordings from the interrogation room, and the materials found in the suspect's apartment, the district prosecutor's office charged Andrea Kirk with attempted murder and kidnapping. The indictment was drawn up in the presence of a lawyer, and Andrea herself was at that time held in a detention facility under constant supervision. At the same time, a decision was made regarding Liam Kendall. The prosecutor's report stated that he acted not as an initiator, but as an accomplice, and that his cooperation with the investigation was substantial. For this, he was recommended a shorter term, which took into account the evidence he had provided, although the final decision was to be made by the court. The official memorandum emphasized, Kendall's testimony was key to establishing the full sequence of events. On the same day, in the hospital of Boise, where Jill Marlowe was in the intensive care unit, there was a turn which the investigators called unexpected but critically important. After a long period of coma, the medical staff recorded a change in her condition. According to the medical report, first there were weak reactions to external stimuli, then short movements of the fingers and a change in the respiratory rhythm. The report of the nurse on duty states, "The patient tried to open her eyes. The understanding of the addressed words at that time was uncertain." During the day, Jill's condition gradually stabilized. After consulting neurologists, it was decided to conduct a control assessment of consciousness. According to the doctor who was present during this procedure, the patient responded slowly, but recognized the voices and attempts to address her. When asked to name the person she wanted to see first, she uttered one short word that was recorded in the minutes: the name Andrea. This fact was immediately reported to the investigators. In internal documents, it is described as a possible recollection of the circumstances of the incident. Law enforcement officers passed the information to Barbara Gray, who, by prior arrangement, was allowed to visit Jill. The hospital visit log states that Barbara arrived accompanied by an officer. Barbara's testimony about this meeting was attached to the case and drawn up in the form of a protocol. According to her, Jill looked weak but was oriented in space, could move her head and answer in short phrases. Barbara reported that when she sat down next to Jill and took her hand, Jill changed her breathing and tried to say something. Her speech was uneven, but the phrases that could be understood were about the events of that night. Barbara's testimony protocol contains several key excerpts. Jill recalled that Andrea asked her to leave the camp to talk, and that it seemed unusual to her, but not threatening. She then described the appearance of the man. The description corresponded to Liam Kendall. According to Jill, at that moment, she tried to retreat, and Andrea's face was distorted by rage. The medical documents emphasize that these statements were incomplete, but clear in emotional meaning. Investigators did not question Jill the same day because doctors recommended to keep contact to a minimum. However, what she told Barbara was enough to confirm Kendall's testimony and establish that the conflict between Andrea and Jill had taken place before the blow. This was also consistent with the psychologist's previous conclusion about Andrea's emotional state at the time of the incident. Further medical records describe Jill's condition as fragile but stabilized. Psychological assessment indicated the presence of memory of key events. The doctor's internal note stated, "The patient demonstrates cognitive preservation and selective memories limited to the traumatic episode." Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office noted that the case had a sufficient evidence base to be submitted to the court. The final summary for that day emphasized, "The facts coincide in all independent sources. The sequence of events has been established. Witness testimony is consistent with medical and forensic findings." For Barbara Gray, this meeting was the first time she was able to confirm that Jill remembered the events of that night. In her testimony, she emphasized that she tried not to talk about the investigation until the medical assessment was completed. She just held her friend's hand and repeated that the danger had passed. In the investigator's official analytical note, this scene is described as a contact that completed the transition from a search operation to a legally completed criminal case. At this stage, the investigation was officially considered complete. All the circumstances of the event were established, the participants were identified, the motive was confirmed, and the testimonies were agreed upon. However, for Jill or those involved in the case, recovery was not a formality. Medical and psychological conclusions explicitly stated that the rehabilitation process would be long and the consequences of the experience would be lasting. The final medical report for that day contained a sentence that was later quoted in the press. The patient's physical condition is treatable, but the psychological consequences of the traumatic experience take a long time. The case was brought to court, and Jill's hospital records became an important part of the evidence base, confirming her ability to recall events and testify.